Thanks, everyone. Thanks for, like she said, coming all the way down. I really appreciate it. I'm Lex. I work for Heroku. And a little bit about Heroku. I promise I'll keep this brief. Heroku is the easiest way to go from code to a running application accessible on the web. As a platform as a service, we provide ops as a service. My job as an SRE at Heroku is to make sure your application is running all the time. On October 21st, 2016, a large portion of the internet fell apart. Technically speaking, the internet itself was fine. Dyn, a major DNS provider used by many companies, came under a massive denial of service attack. I think it was like a terabit or something. Domains using only Dyn for name servers were effectively unreachable because DNS queries to Dyn servers timed out. Lots of companies were affected. Was anyone here affected? I was, yeah. Okay. I'll give you a sec to snap a photo of these QR codes if you want, but just so you know, the slides will be available on the Velocity site, and there are extra footnotes in the references if you want to like figure out how I found things out, where I sources, that kind of thing. Okay. There we go. Okay, so your one and only DNS provider goes down. Your customers can't reach you. What do you do to get up and running again? Nothing. You have to plan ahead. Period. That's it. Thanks for coming. At the time, I was pretty certain of this, that there was nothing that we could do. I was actually running incident command for the incident. I'm like, folks, we're done. But proving or disproving this was really difficult. I'm going to show you why this is so murky and how I proved it to myself over the coming weeks and all the questions I ran into along the way. After that, I'm going to show you why planning ahead can be hard too. Time for a crash course in DNS. I've got a lot to cover, so hold on tight. I'm going to assume that you know a little bit about how DNS works, but I'm also going to do some review to try to get us on the same page. DNS is a recursive hierarchy. The tree is broken up into zones that are owned by different entities. A zone roughly corresponds to a domain like foo.com. Here's an example zone for Heroku. Each zone has records in it, AAC name, etc. Lots of different kinds. The IN stands for internet if you're curious. Here are the NS records that specify the name servers for our zone. They are the servers that know all the records in our zone and the correct values. Above Heroku.com in the tree is com, or the TLD, or top-level domain. Com holds NS records for every .com domain. That's a bunch. Adding these NS records is done by your domain registrar. And adding and serving them is what you're paying them for when you register your domain. Those NS records for your domain in the TLD are called glue records. There can be A records for your name servers too. There can't be anything else for your zone in com's zone, since you own your zone. Those glue records denote a zone cut. Pay attention here because zone cuts are where everything gets really interesting. A zone cut is a boundary in ownership. They own com, and I own Heroku.com, and everything below it. I could even carve off a zone cut under Heroku.com if I really felt like it. Above com is dot, the root of the hierarchy. Notice the trailing period that I've added to all the domains, Heroku.com, dot, etc. Usually the dot is implied, but it's omitted. Dot has zone cuts for all of the TLDs, like .com, .net, country codes, .cc, hipster names, all the .tech and .travel nonsense. I really hate those things. The key to DNS scaling is caching. Every record has a TTL, or time to live. This determines how long the cache can hold the record for. DNS requests are performed recursively. Let's say that I want to know the address for www.heroku.com. assuming that I have an empty cache, I have to ask the root nameservers first. They don't change very often, like on the scale of years, so I'll keep a static list of all the root nameservers. So I go to them and I ask them, straight up, I ask them, what's the address for www.heroku.com. And they tell me, buzz off, I don't know that address. Go ask comms nameservers, they can tell you. Here are their addresses, here's where you can find them. So I ask .com's nameservers, and they tell me to buzz off too. They don't know anything about under Heroku.com. And they tell me to go ask Heroku.com's nameservers and give me the addresses for them. Finally, in this case, I ask Heroku.com's nameservers, and they actually give me my answer. In the future, I'll have a list of Heroku.com nameservers cached, and I can go to them directly. But my PC at home probably isn't going to do this whole thing itself, unless I'm a nerd and I've set it up to have a caching nameserver on it. I have, actually. It's going to ask a caching resolver, probably my ISP's or Google's 8.8.8.8. A caching resolver is a special nameserver. When I ask it a question it doesn't know the answer to, it doesn't tell me to buzz off. It does the whole recursive lookup behind the scenes for me, going to the root, going to com, going to my, the Heroku.com's nameservers, and it returns the result to me after it finds it. And it caches it, and all the steps along the way. This saves me the effort of having to implement all that recursive behavior, and lets me benefit from sharing a cache with a bunch of people. When the Dyn attack started, lots of folks were suddenly reminded terribly that they had only one DNS provider for their zone. Once resolver caches started expiring, it was like our site was down. Customers couldn't reach us. Worse yet, customers couldn't reach some of the apps on our platform. That's really bad. Caches began expiring immediately as each resolver ran through the remainder of the TTL for the records in its cache, depending on when it had cached them. OK, so we're in the middle of this attack. Dyn is down. Can we just add an NS record for a server that's not under attack? Maybe I'll get a different provider. I don't know if NS1's here tonight. Here is the crux of the problem. The top-level domain name servers, at least for .com and .net, and that's important, serve Glue records with a 2-day time to live. This is to reduce load on them. They do not let you change this. You can add a new NS record if you want. It might actually take a little while for your registrar to get it into comms name servers. You can do that if you want. But it's possible that you will be down for some customers who are behind resolvers that had cached the old records for up to a full 2 days, depending on when they had cached the 2-day TTL Glue records. Based on my understanding at the time of the attack, I was pretty sure that there's no way around this. But I wasn't completely sure. I had some doubts. Here's why. For starters, DNS is a pretty simple protocol, right? Seems pretty simple. The spec is pretty simple. It specifies where all the bits go. The spec nails down a lot, but it leaves a surprising amount open to interpretation. Each resolver's implementation behaves differently. And for true reliability, I have to take into account the vast majority of all behaviors of all resolvers across the internet. Some resolvers, upon seeing that all of the name servers for your domain are down, like say if Dyn gets attacked, will automatically just forget about their cache and go ask the TLD name servers for your domain's NS records again. The idea is that if your name servers are down, there's a good chance you might be doing some incident response, and you might try to add some new ones with your registrar. The downside is that this requerying of the TLD name servers slams them. Some resolvers will actually do that requery every single time they receive a query for the domain if the name servers are down. Most of the time, this won't actually even net new NS records. That's why they keep doing it. There's an RFC that discusses this behavior and says that everyone should cut it out. It's killing the top-level domain name servers. In fact, you can go and look in the RFC and they have numbers, and it's just like slamming them with traffic. The bottom line is, even if some resolvers do this, it's not good enough for us unless all of them do it. Do they all do it? In the weeks after the Dyn attack, some folks lowered the TTL of the NS records inside their zone. Remember, we've got the glue records in COM, or whichever, but we also have NS records inside our zone. I observed this lowering behavior in at least one major code sharing platform that loves anatomically dubious cats. But when will anyone actually see the NS records in your zone? Remember, in the normal case, there is no reason for the resolver to query your zone's NS records. They already have the glue from the top-level domain. The only reason they do that is if someone asks them specifically for the NS records for your zone. What happens when a cache has its glue records for your domain expire? In theory, that resolver should go back to the top-level domain's name servers to ask again for the domain. It has no more information about the name servers for that zone, so it should move up one level in the hierarchy to find that information again. Some folks think that resolvers will query the zone's name servers for new NS records to refresh their cache. Following the spec precisely, though, would mean that they can only query the zone's name servers if they still have the NS record cached. So perhaps these resolvers are like preemptively refreshing the NS records for your zone before they expire. This does not seem very likely to me. They'd have to like go through their whole cache and refresh all of them that are about to expire. The glue NS records, the interesting thing is that they are not authoritative for your zone. Only the records inside your zone are authoritative for your zone. Under the DNS spec, a resolver may cache a non-authoritative record. However, if they have a cached non-authoritative record, like a glue record, and they come across in some way an authoritative version of that same record, they must replace the glue record in their cache. But the spec doesn't explicitly nail down whether that cache must respect the lower TTL on the NS records inside the zone instead of the higher TTL from the glue records, especially if the values are exactly the same. It just doesn't mention at all what to do. Interesting note, in practice, we see 8 NS queries per second on Heroku. Like people specifically asking Heroku.com name servers, what are the NS records for Heroku.com? So at least some resolvers do query in-zone NS records automatically in theory, unless some weirdo is going around and querying our NS records a bunch, like 8 times a second. It's you, I know it. Some name servers will volunteer their zone's NS records in the authority section of the reply. The spec doesn't require this, and almost implies not to. The authority section is supposed to be for that zone cut behavior. If I ask COM for a record inside Heroku.com, they will say, here are Heroku.com's NS records, and they will put that in the authority section to say, here's who's authoritative for that zone. This volunteering behavior that you see here is inconsistent even on the same DNS provider. Dyn, for example, will volunteer NS records with A records, but not with a CNAME record. So if you query something that has a CNAME, you don't get NS records in the response. If you query something that has an A record, you do get NS records. So do resolvers replace their cached glue records with records from the authority section? They are DNS records, right? They're just in the authority section, not the answer section. RFC 2181 says, do this. Data from anywhere can be cached. But again, it doesn't specify whether they must also lower the TTL of their existing records in their cache. So do they do this? Do they lower that TTL? No. Caching resolvers do not consistently replace glue NS records in their cache. And to prove that to you, I've got this originally named test domain that I've set up. If we query this zone's nameservers directly, we can see that they volunteer NS records, just like I showed you in the authority section. And the NS records inside the zone have a TTL of 300 seconds. Now, let's use the DNS Lookingglass, dns-lg.com. I love those people. If any of them are in the audience, I love you. Your tool is so useful to me. We're going to ask the DNS Lookingglass to see how resolvers behave. So what that tool does is you send it a query, and it sends the query out to a bunch of caching resolvers that it knows about and shows you what they said in response. So you can kind of get a cross-section of DNS behavior across a wide range of the internet. I really owe these folks a debt of gratitude for making this tool available. So this resolver here in Denmark, along with a few others in the DNS Lookingglass, returns a TTL, as you can see, is way longer than 300 seconds. So where could it have gotten that information from? This TTL could only come from glue records provided by the top-level domain nameservers. Since we know the nameservers for this domain volunteer those NS records with a lower TTL in the authority section, and we sent normal queries to this resolver to get it to see those, then that means that this caching resolver must be not replacing the glue records in its cache with the lower TTL ones in the zone. Arguably, this is a violation of the RFC, but again, it's not really specific about the TTL, so the facts of the record are the same. It's just the TTL is different. Bottom line is, this means we cannot trust resolvers to properly lower the TTL of our NS records, which in turn means that they may take up to 2 days to notice if I add NS records in my registrar in .com. So that is nail number 1 in the coffin of can I do anything during an attack. Here's nail number 2. .io, the .io TLD, failed in a very interesting way exactly a week after the Dyn attack on October 28th, 2016. It's possible this was due to another denial of service. Lots of .io sites went down. Breaking news, actually, just about 2 weeks ago, .io failed in exactly the same way. In both of these cases, some, but not all, of .io's TLD nameservers returned no such domain for legit domains, an X domain. This was a total pain, but it also provided us with some very interesting insight. If resolvers renewed NS records with the zone's nameservers, as some folks claim, then those resolvers would never have seen the invalid no such domain responses from the TLD nameservers. Only resolvers that had never seen a given zone before would have gone to the TLD nameservers. But the outage was widespread. Pretty much any .io name that you could find was having issues. So at least a large cohort of resolvers must not behave this way. That's nail number 2. As a side note, vanity TLDs look really awesome, right? They're a reliability nightmare. You have to be able to trust your TLD nameservers. Otherwise, you are completely sunk. Like, if your TLD nameservers go down, it does not matter if you have 5 DNS providers in your NS records. If they don't serve them, you're done. So we have just seen 2 compelling bits of evidence, either one of which would be enough on its own. Lowering the TTL for your NS records in your zone doesn't help. There is no avoiding it. You can't add nameservers to your domain to escape an outage. You're not going to have a reliable number of people seeing them. At least some of your customers will still be unable to reach your domain for up to 2 days afterward. So what can we do? We have to use multiple DNS providers. If one of them goes down, then the other one will hopefully continue operating, unless you've got an attack on both, in which case the internet has really fallen apart. DNS is designed to handle the failure of nameservers. If a resolver is unable to reach one of the nameservers for your zone, it will automatically and transparently try the rest. Each resolver will also develop a sort of opinion of your nameservers. It will stop sending queries to the dead ones pretty quickly. And it will then occasionally send queries to the dead ones to see if they're back up. It will, but only every once in a while. It will also somewhat favor faster and possibly closer nameservers for your zone. All of your nameservers, even across two providers or multiple providers, should return the same answers for all queries for records in your zone. That means they all have to have the same information. Even when you make changes to your zone, they all have to get the changes. DNS has a built-in synchronization mechanism called zone transfers. This is also known as AXFR and IXFR. One nameserver is designated as the master. Interesting side note, this one need not actually be publicly listed in your NS records for your zone at the TLD. All the rest will check the master periodically for the latest info about your zone. The master can optionally even proactively reach out, push, and tell them when the zone has been changed by sending a notify message. This is all part of the DNS spec. The problem is, zone transfers don't support proprietary pseudo records like aliases. Alias, that's a feature that is varyingly and differently supported on some providers and is not part of the DNS spec. It's like a CNAME, but it works better. Some providers also support like weight-based load balancing, that kind of thing. Another problem is that some providers don't even support inbound or even outbound zone transfers at all. This means you can't use the industry standard protocol, designed in way of synchronizing your domain with them. So let's say you have a single provider and you use alias records and you want to add redundancy after a major outage. What can you do? Option one, go vanilla. Alias records are not strictly required, but they make some things a lot easier. If you get rid of them, you can pick a set of DNS providers that support zone transfers, and you can move on with your life. The problem is, this takes a lot of work. It may not even be feasible for you, given your use of pseudo records. You may also have a lot of process and tooling built around your current DNS provider, especially if you're dynamically creating records. We certainly were in this position. Option two is to revamp your tooling to make it right to both providers, to keep them in sync, essentially manually, not really auto-manually. Your tooling will need to translate between multiple dialects of alias records to get equivalent behavior on both providers. This takes a lot of engineering effort. And for us, it was so much engineering effort that it was infeasible in the short term. It's also going to make your DNS infrastructure a lot more complicated. And that's just another piece of code that can fail. There are some tools that can help out with mirroring your DNS records across providers. An example is OctoDNS by GitHub. I think they actually wrote OctoDNS as a direct result of the Dyn outage. Another example is DNS Control by Stack Exchange. Both of those are open source. So let's say that you are stuck on a provider that doesn't support outbound zone transfers. And let's say, or you're stuck for the reasons that we were, that we couldn't change our tooling fast enough. Say that implementing dual writing will take a large amount of effort, so you want some redundancy now. This is the situation we had with our biggest zone. And we're talking hundreds of thousands of records here. Our goal was to put a Band-Aid solution for redundancy into place, to buy us some time to do the big DNS change. So our idea was to keep sort of an extra nameserver off to the side. This one will be listed in our NS records, given out by the TLD, and available to take over in case our main provider failed. We would periodically pull a static list of DNS records out of Route 53, in this case, and populate it into this nameserver. We found that we could dump a static list of all the records out of Route 53, and it would take about 20 minutes. It's a big zone. This means that the spare nameserver we set up would be behind by 20 minutes. If Route 53 is down, though, I'm willing to accept 20-minute-old data versus people not being able to reach anything at all. But I don't want it to serve records in the normal case, since it's behind. I want resolvers to ignore my spare nameserver. So how can I make them do that? The idea is to make our spare nameserver really distasteful to resolvers. That way, resolvers should ignore it when they build their opinions during the normal case of operations. When our primary nameserver fails, like if it comes under attack, we just hit the switch, make the spare behave normally, take the poo off. The trick is, we don't want to make resolvers so afraid of this nameserver that they'll never send it queries, even if it's the only nameserver that's alive. So a poorly written exponential backoff algorithm in a resolver might only retry once a day, or maybe every 2 days or something, even if all the other nameservers are dead. So how can we make the spare just distasteful enough? Option 1, refuse connections on port 53. This way, resolvers can't possibly get the stale results. The failover plan is to just start up bind, in this case. And resolvers should notice that it's up, and they should start favoring it more, especially since the rest of our nameservers are down. Option 2, use traffic shaping to delay all responses from our nameserver. The delay has to be long enough that resolvers will drop this nameserver's priority, but short enough that they don't think it's totally dead and thus distrust it forever. So we chose 2 seconds in this case. Option 3, tell bind that it's not authoritative for the zone. So bind is going to return a valid DNS response that says, buzz off, I can't answer you, go ask the root. And our failover plan is to just tell bind, hey, you're authoritative now. As a bonus, there might even be a third-party DNS provider that I could tell to be non-authoritative. If any of the NS1 guys were in the room, this is something I mentioned yesterday. Yeah. If you provide that feature, we could use you for this, and that'd be really cool. So which one of these 3 works the best? How long does it take resolvers to send queries to the lukewarm spare if the main nameservers fail? There's only one way to find out. We got to test it. So I registered 3 cheap domains to test out the 3 options. Quick note. Always use Whois privacy when you're registering domains. Even if you think no one's going to find out about your domain, because it's just a toy domain to test with, right? The top-level domains or registrars or somebody sells a list of all new domains. So I'm still getting spam calls. No, I do not care that my new domains are not in Google search results. Trust me. So we created 3 separate test scenarios for the 3 options. Mercury and Venus are our 2 normal nameservers. Earth, Mars, and Jupiter were the lukewarm spares for option 1, 2, and 3, respectively. So we sent DNS requests through the DNS Lookingglass, thanks again, folks, to all the resolvers for 24 hours for our domains. This allows the resolvers time to form an opinion of our nameservers, and especially to form an opinion of those lukewarm spares. Then we made Earth, Mars, and Jupiter stop looking distasteful and took Mercury and Venus down. Now our lukewarm spares are the only ones that are viable nameservers for our zone. And finally, we sent more requests through the Lookingglass to see what would happen. Option 1 worked OK. It took 10 minutes for most nameservers to send queries to Earth. But then they were going to Earth. So we were down for 10 minutes. You know, we would, theoretically, if Dyn had gone down, we were down for 10 minutes, and then we were up. Pretty good. Better than being down for hours. Option 2 was a little better. It took less time for the resolvers to start sending queries to our spare, Mars. The downside is that some queries, remember this is the one that we're delaying responses, but we're still sending those out-of-date responses. So some queries probably did leak through to Mars even while Earth and Venus were up. So those queries would have gotten stale results. Unfortunately, we didn't log this. We could rerun the experiment, but we don't need to because we have our answer. Option 3, non-authoritative nameserver, worked really well, surprisingly so. All of the resolvers quickly noticed that Jupyter was suddenly authoritative and started sending it queries right away. This performed way better than refusing connections. And there's no possibility of leakage in the normal case. It's not returning answers. There's one outlier. For up to 30 minutes, Google liked to occasionally send requests to Mercury and Venus, the dead ones, even after they were down. Maybe this was to see if they were back up or something. It seemed to pick randomly whether it was going to do this, and this caused slow lookups in the cases when it had done this. And if it had picked to send both to Mercury and then to Venus, and then it would move on to our lukewarm, well, then the whole DNS lookup seemed to time out, and it returned server failed. Server failure, I can't answer your question. So if we enabled Venus, one of our ones we had taken down, but kept Mars down, then this effect was all but eliminated. So we think that if we had multiple lame duck, non-authoritative spares, then we would sort of statistically beat out the chance that query gets sent to both dead ones. And this works out OK. So as it turns out, DNS, while seemingly simple, is actually full of a ton of gnarly little nuances. The only way to be really sure about something is to test it in the wild with a carefully designed experiment. I thought I knew a ton about DNS before. I've written some pretty involved DNS-related tooling. But I still learned a ton in the week or two while I did this research. I learned that you can't add nameservers to escape an outage. You can keep a lukewarm spare if you make it a lame duck, if you make it non-authoritative. If you only have one DNS provider for your domain, you are at serious risk. It doesn't matter how reliable your infrastructure is if your customers can't find its address to reach it. It's time to take a close look at your DNS and make a plan to add another provider. That's it. I'm definitely here for questions. Also, my side project is SRE Weekly. That's Site Reliability Engineering or Service Reliability Engineering Weekly. It's a newsletter where I talk about all sorts of things related to reliability, from designing reliable Redis setup to how to do incident response and how to analyze how your engineers made mistakes and modify your system to make it better. Feel free to subscribe, please. And also, if you have articles that you've written that you think might be good for the audience, please send them my way. I can take questions now. Do we have a microphone? And I'll also be out in the hall.
Thank you, Lex.
One more thing, by the way. Heroku is not a sponsor of SRE Weekly. It's completely separate.
OK, any questions?
Hi. I was wondering if you tried changing the weights of the A records for the NS records. Like if you tried, if you have ns1.heroku.com, but have another A record for ns1.heroku.com with a higher weight.
What do you mean by weight?
DNS can be weighted, right? So you can have two A records for the same IP address with different weights, and you say prefer this one, even though not all clients honor that.
Well, no. So strictly speaking, there's not a weight field in the A record. So the question is, can we change the weights on the A records for my name servers? There is a weight for an SRV record. What you might be thinking of is pseudo records. So providers like Dyn or NS1 allow waiting for the different A records in a round robin set. But all of this is actually irrelevant because the A records for like ns1.heroku.com, like if I set my name server for my domain heroku.com to ns1.heroku.com, if I go and ask the TLD, hey, I want give me the A record for www.heroku.com, it's going to say, buzz off, go talk to Heroku's name servers. They are ns1.heroku.com. And I'm going to say, I don't know how to answer this because you just told me to ask the name server for, and you gave me a domain that's inside Heroku.com. So that's where the other part of the glue records comes in. The TLD will know the A record for ns1.heroku.com and will actually directly serve that A record to people that are querying when it's doing the referral. So a resolver is not actually going to go in my zone to look up ns1.heroku.com. It doesn't need to. It's already going to have it from the glue records from the TLD. So bottom line is, waiting doesn't matter. I can't set weights in the TLD because weights aren't a thing in the DNS spec. Okay. Thank you. Really good question. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Thanks. I was trying to follow along where you went through the 3 scenarios you were testing, and then lame duck was the best. Like, what led you? Can you reiterate what led you to go down those 3 routes? Like, you were only going down that route because of
so this
the
is the
alias record that, I mean, let's call them non-DNS spec records that led you down that path. Is that really why you'd consider like the lame duck solution?
So a couple of reasons led us to do that. First of all, we had a massive set of tooling around creating domains in our zone. And trying to re-engineer that tooling to create the domains in Dyn and, say, NS1 or somebody else or Route 53, while obviously that's feasible, you just create it in both ones, and you could try to do some offline process to keep them in sync, so you have to periodically go through and make sure nothing got missed because your queuing messed up or something. That was going to be a big engineering effort in order to make sure that that was reliable. And we wanted to have our DNS be reliable before we had taken the month or 2 it took to do that engineering effort. So we wanted a quick solution.
Right, and the only reason you were even thinking about having to talk to 2 DNS vendors simultaneous is because you couldn't really trust their adherence to the transfers?
Actually, because for that zone, our only DNS provider was Route 53.
Yeah,
and they don't do zone transfers at all.
There we go. So if you chose 2 vendors that played nicely, then you wouldn't have to go down the lane.
Yes, if I had thought ahead, and if I had been on just Dyn and just using just using standard vanilla records, then I could have just added. And for one of our zones, we were on Dyn, and we did just add another provider and set up zone transfers. Yeah, so this is all kind of an interesting diversion, the lukewarm spare thing, but not necessarily applicable to all cases. But it was really interesting to research it.
Any other questions? Okay, thank you so much, Lex. We're going to break.
Thanks, everyone.
And come back at 4:45.